I'm most grateful to Professor Mathama Mwasia for nominating me for this award in the first place, and then to the SAAB committee for considering my nomination worthy of support. The award comes with an actual shiny silver medal, and I feel honored to be part of this list of South African botanists, many of whom were my lecturers, mentors, colleagues, and friends at one time or another. I'm also most grateful to the many students and colleagues with whom I've worked over more than 35 years, as well as to the institutions who have supported me. I thought I would use this occasion to share with you the main focus of my research over the last 3.5 decades. Pretty much throughout this time, I've been interested in how and why the vegetation of Southern Africa has changed over time. As my understanding has grown, I've also become interested in how these historical changes tie in with what my colleagues are saying is likely to happen in the future. This talk is based on an article that I wrote with my friends Rick Rody and Lindsay Gilson for the journal Anthropocene in 2019, with a rather provocative title, Rethinking Catastrophe, Historical Trajectories and Modeled Future Vegetation Change in Southern Africa. For those interested, there was a critical response to our article in 2020 by 2 colleagues from WITS, and the journal also then gave us the opportunity to respond to their critique, which we did. What I'd like to cover in this webinar follows quite closely the content of the 2019 paper. I'll introduce the idea that a continuum exists between the past, the present, and the future, and then provide a brief summary of what has been written about Southern Africa's environmental future. We've relied quite heavily on repeat photography in our work, and so I need to explain how we do this in a bit more detail. Then the bulk of the webinar will be spent on a discussion of some of the major biomes in Southern Africa and how we think they have changed over the last century. Not all of the historical trajectories tie in with the future projections, and I'd like to suggest a few ideas as to why this might be the case. Finally, the webinar will conclude with a general discussion. Climate change models have had a significant influence on a wide range of national and global policies that affect the way society uses energy, consumes natural resources, and prepares for a more sustainable future. However, future projections on their own provide insufficient justification for large-scale interventions in the way society functions and uses resources. They require a great deal of trust in the scientific community who produce them. It's our view that greater reconciliation and integration of findings from paleoecological studies, historical observations, satellite-based remote sensing products and models will help to build a stronger, evidence-based policy framework. The rationale for this past, present, future continuum, therefore, is that knowledge of the past helps us to establish baseline conditions, while an assessment of the present helps to get an idea of the nature, the extent, and rate of change. Knowing this, in turn, will help to assess future trajectories of change and to develop suitable responses. So, what has been said about the future of Southern African climates? While some of the details have changed over time, most climate change scenarios suggest that Southern Africa will become hotter and drier over the next 100 years. Some projections are that temperatures will be as much as 7 degrees Celsius warmer in the central Kalahari region by 2100, while the winter rainfall region will be heavily impacted by a weakening and southward retreat of the main rain-bearing systems as a result of global warming. The recent mega drought over the Western Cape has been described as the harbinger of things to come. And what is the evidence to date? There have been surprisingly few published syntheses of historical trends in key climate variables such as temperature and rainfall for the country. The 2014 paper by Neil McKellar and colleagues is one of the more recent contributions and shows that the projections for temperature are largely on track, except for the central interior, where minimum temperatures decreased over the period 1960 to 2010. Trends in rainfall are spatially variable and are not well reflected in the downscaled climate model simulations. While we await an updated national synthesis, Several local and regional analyses are available and make for interesting reading. For example, in 2011, we analyzed climate data from 20 ARC weather stations in the Western Cape for the period 1965 to 2005. To our amazement, we found that while temperature had increased in the region and rainfall had no trend, evaporation, as measured from an APAN, had decreased significantly over the period of measurement. Wind run too had declined significantly at most of the weather stations, and the relationship between the two is obvious. This so-called evaporation paradox is a global phenomenon and deserves more focus than it has currently received in South Africa, especially since it has such a significant influence on soil moisture and plant growth. If climate change projections for Southern Africa suggest a hotter and drier future, what are the implications of this for vegetation, for biodiversity, and for ecosystem function? We looked at about 10 of the main papers and reports which model how Southern African environments might change in the future in response to climate change. The details are in a paper, but for the western part of the region, the projections are that the increase in temperature will lead to a general aridification of the environment, resulting in the contraction of more mesic biomes and expansion of arid shrublands and deserts, and even possibly the remobilization of the Kalahari dune fields. About a third of all species in these areas will be negatively affected. For the eastern summer rainfall areas, the major change will be an increase in woody plant cover and the contraction of the grassland biome as a result of carbon dioxide enrichment and increased temperature, with negative impacts on biodiversity as well. Other effects mentioned include an increase in fire frequency, negative impacts on the hydrology of rivers and wetlands, and several significant negative social impacts as well, including on agricultural production. These projections have had an important influence on policy, on research, and on our actions. The models on which the projections are based have been developed by many individuals who are national and international leaders in their field and reflect some of the best science in the discipline. We don't question these projections, but take them at face value. Instead, our focus is to ask whether the projections envisaged for the future are already evident in the historical trends of environmental change. If they're not yet evident, then it makes sense to ask why that might be the case. So, how are we doing? Firstly, how do we know how environments have changed? There are many ways to study the past, including through the disciplines shown here, such as paleoecology and archaeology, each one of which has its own specialist demands. Our focus in the paper and in what follows has been on repeat ground photography, on archival sources, and occasionally on botanical surveys. Our emphasis is on the landscape and on the historical processes that have shaped the environment that we see today. We are fortunate in Southern Africa in having such a rich photographic history. Botanists such as I.B. Paul Evans, Rudolf Marloth, Margaret Levins, and John Acox took many photographs of Southern African landscapes during their careers, and they are a rich source of information for anyone interested in traveling back in time. To date, our collection of historical landscape photographs at the Plant Conservation Unit comprises about 30,000 images from more than 80 photographers. Having a printout of an historical photograph is one thing. You need to find the location in order to retake the image. We usually start with maps, and these days with a Google Earth tour, but it often comes down to opening farm gates, knocking on doors, and speaking to landowners. This gives you the chance to not only meet some pretty interesting and creative people, but also to find out about the land use history of the site as well. Usually, however, it's just you and the photograph, and you can spend hours and even days driving around trying to find a site. But when you find it and are able to step into the time machine and look at changes over 130 years, such as in this Namib desert scene, it makes it all worthwhile. Once you find the general location, the work really starts. First, you need to find the exact location, then set up the tripod and start with the documentation process. This involves not only the obvious things like recording the GPS coordinates and drawing a sketch map to help future visitors, documenting the cameras and settings for the range of photographs that you need to take, including a panorama of the location, but most importantly also the changes that are evident in the landscape. The way in which we document the changes is to firstly divide the landscape into different landform units such as rivers and plains, terraces, and then to physically walk into the image, sampling each of these landforms in turn. Ideally, a permanent record of the transect can be created by using the breadcrumbs trail option on a GPS. We usually take additional photographs of each of the landforms, such as this one of the Sandy River course, as well as of the dominant or important species in the landscape, and we make notes of what we see that could help us in interpreting the changes over time. We also usually provide a checklist of the main species in each of the landforms and an estimate of the percent cover of each species in the unit. Notes are also made of population sizes, mortality within different size classes, erosional features, grazing impacts, and so on. After sampling, we get together at the camera station and talk about the changes and draft in the field a short narrative of change for each of the different landforms, such as the Sandy River course, the granite mountain in the foreground of this image, and so on. At a site like this in Namibia, we could spend most of the day photographing, sampling, documenting, and discussing the changes in the landscape. Our approach in the field is mostly qualitative, but once we get back to the lab and have matched the historical and repeat photographs, we try and provide a more quantitative assessment of the changes evident over time. We've tried a range of different approaches, including point frequency estimates using a grid, such as you see in the two images on the left, in which we score the proportion of, say, bare ground, shrub, and grass cover. We've also tried to automate the process using supervised and unsupervised classification techniques in GIS, but these have also run into a few problems, especially since the original images are usually in black and white and don't have the diversity in tone to be able to differentiate between different species and growth forms. What we've settled on for the biome level summaries is an estimate of cover based on a 5-point vegetation cover change index. We usually get 3 or 4 ecologists together, look at a pair of images and decide through consensus whether the cover of different growth forms has increased or decreased according to the criteria shown here. For example, for this particular comparison, we could probably agree that there's been an increase in tree cover over time, probably between about 5 and 25%. We then score this pair as +1. After doing this for all the match photographs in a biome, we count the number of photos in each class and express this as a percentage of the total number of photographs for the different landforms in each biome. A quick look at the summary graph, for example, will show that this biome, most of the images show no change in cover, although the distribution is skewed to the right, especially within the rivers and ephemeral streams. A much smaller proportion of the photographs show a decline in vegetation over time. So this is more or less what we've been doing for the last few decades, and so far I've assembled a collection of about 2,000 images, which are reflected by the black dots you see on this map of Southern Africa. Sam Jack, myself, Rick Rody, and James Patek have taken most of the repeats, together with many students who have used them in a variety of postgraduate studies and theses. About 5 years ago, we also launched Rephoto SA together with the support of Les Underhill and Rene Navarra under the recent direction of the Fitzpatrick Institute. And this is a citizen science project, and we've added about 280 additional photographs been added by citizen scientists across the country. Repeat photography has been used in about 60 studies of long-term vegetation change in Africa. The main strengths of this technique are firstly that the images cover a unique time period that sits between paleoecological studies on the one hand and botanical surveys on the other. The second strength is that the images allow you to see a level of detail that's often missing in remotely sensed images derived from satellites and even in aerial photography. In some cases, species and growth forms can be identified and even population sizes estimated. Photographs are also easily accessible and they're understood by everybody. One of the major limitations of the technique is that most repeat photos only include 2 time steps. This snapshot sampling can be a problem, as incorrect assumptions about what has happened in the intervening years can lead to the wrong conclusion about the trajectory of change. Also, differences in the time of year and even time of day when the 2 photographs are taken can lead to problems of interpretation. Each image is also unique, and sorting out appropriate analytical techniques to assess change has been quite a challenge. So what do the repeat photographs suggest about how each of the Southern Africa's biomes have changed over time? We're going to start with the desert biome. The results shown here are based on a study published by Rick and colleagues in the Journal of Arid Environments in 2019. The analysis is based on 75 repeat photos shown in the map on the left, which were taken in 4 vegetation units, distributed across gradients of precipitation and fog. In general, rainfall increases and the incidence of fog decreases as you move away from the coast. This results in a fog belt zone along the coast, a savanna transition zone further inland, and a grassland shrubland zone between the two. Several large ephemeral rivers such as the Khan, the Swartkops, and the Kwieseb also run through the Namib Desert. The focus of this study was on the changes in woody plant cover over the last 100 years in order to assess hypotheses about aridification and the expansion of arid adapted species into more mesic environments as a result of climate change. The diagram in the top left of this slide shows the percent cover of woody plants in the original photograph and the percent cover in the repeat photograph for each of the 4 vegetation types. The red line is where y equals x, and if all before and after photos were aligned along the red line, then there would be no change in woody vegetation cover. The blue line shows the line of best fit to the data we collected at each photo site. The overall pattern is that there was very little change in woody cover in the vegetation units closest to the coast, but significant increases in the savanna transition zone, and especially in the large ephemeral rivers of the Namib. In some of the fog belt sites, there was clear recruitment of new individuals of the fog belt specialist Arthurua lubitzii, such as is seen here in this image from near Rossing Mountain. The green dots in the bottom right photograph denote new recruits. Overall, however, the change in cover was not significant in the fog belt zone, perhaps also because of the very low cover values of woody plants to start with in this zone. And here's another site within the fog belt zone which makes the point about there being very little noticeable change in the vegetation in this zone. The grass shrub zone in the image on the 2 images on the left was also stable, although several sites closer to the coast, just outside of the fog belt zone, showed a slight loss of cover. You can see the blue arrows show 2 trees that were still present nearly 100 years later. The pair of photographs on the right, however, show a very typical pattern of increasing woody plant cover in the savanna transition zone. Bush encroachment in the arid savannas of Namibia has been reported on for decades and was also reported on by Rick and I in our 2012 paper on long-term changes in the Namakuru and savanna biomes of Namibia. The greatest increase in woody plant cover was in the large ephemeral rivers, such as you see here at Gobabeb, although this image shows a relatively modest increase since 1965. Cover values were generally high, with each river system presenting distinct traits in relation to vegetation change. Some rivers were more stable than others, and some were more impacted by people and invasive alien plants than others. What happens upstream has implications for what we see in the landscape downstream. A general summary for our Central Namib Desert study would read as follows. Firstly, woody cover has increased in all zones except in the grass shrubland zone where there's considerable variability between sites. Landscapes in the region generally had less cover in the first half of the 20th century than they have today. Desert and arid shrubland vegetation types, representative of the hot desert zone, have not expanded into the region's grassy savannas, and there's little evidence for the general aridification hypothesis as yet. If anything, the opposite has occurred. Our results suggest a stable or perhaps slight increase in the incidence of fog, and a westward expansion of rainfall in the savanna transition zone. What happens to the Benguela has important implications for the fog belt zone. A tipping point might, of course, just be around the corner, but we see no evidence of this as yet. So let's move on to the succulent Karoo biome. The synthesis for this area, which we outlined in our Rethinking Catastrophe paper, draws on an examination of more than 250 photographs and a number of papers which we have published in the peer-reviewed literature, the most important of which are highlighted in blue. The key results of this work suggest that most comparisons show little change in vegetation cover on the slopes and the plains habitats of the succulent Karoo biome. Remember, this is the biome which in the early projections was considered to be most vulnerable to climate change and subject to aridification because of the weakening of the cyclonic westerlies and the failure of winter rains. However, our analysis suggests that there are more comparisons between photopairs which show an increase in cover than a decrease. Only about 10% of the photographs we've assessed show a decrease in cover. As was the case in the Namib Desert study, the ephemeral rivers of the succulent Karoo show the greatest increase in cover. Here's a rather typical scene in the succulent Karoo taken by Paul Evans in 1920 near the farm Tierhoek just west of Calvinia. Cover is quite sparse and is dominated by kopokbos and a few low-growing succulents. 85 years later, there's little difference except perhaps for a slight increase in height and perhaps a small increase in the cover of dominant shrubs. Ephemeral rivers are critical habitats in dryland ecosystems because water flows through them occasionally and change usually occurs more rapidly than on the plains. They're often also a good indicator of environmental health for the wider region as well. As our earlier graph suggests, it is in the ephemeral river systems where woody cover has increased the most, as you can see from the site near Ladysmith in the Cape. While shoteas and eucalypts are present in the river, the change in woody plant cover is largely as a result of the increase in Vachellia Karoo. Up until 2015, most long-term analyses of rainfall showed no significant change over the course of the 20th century in the succulent Karoo. Given the recent mega drought in the region, most recent analyses might show a different pattern. We argued, however, that the change in land use practices in the succulent Karoo might account for some of the differences we observed between our matched photographs. For example, the total number of livestock has declined by 2/3 since the 1950s, while the area sown to wheat is only a fraction of what it used to be as recently as the early 1970s, when the practice was heavily subsidized by the state and farmers were incentivized to clear lands for wheat. The abandonment of old lands is evident throughout the biome, such as this photograph of a recovering field just south of Springbok shows. The impact of these old lands on the ecology of the succulent Karoo is yet to be fully assessed, as it takes upwards of 100 years for an old ploughed field in the Maculand to support similar levels of diversity as adjacent unploughed land. There are a number of locations, however, which have challenged our generally positive narrative for the biome. The first is the site on Cornell's Kop, where our repeat photos show a collapse of mature trees over the last 50 years. We interpret these changes and those for other tree aloes not necessarily in terms of recent climate change impacts, but rather as part of a much longer process of climate change, which needs to consider climatic conditions during the 18th and 19th centuries when these tall trees would have recruited. Another location which has given us pause for thought is the site just west of Kubus in the southern Ruchtesveld. a formerly quite dense stand of Brownanthus pseudo-schlichtianus has been devastated either by aridification or by grazing. We are not sure which. Norbert Jürgens, who knows the region better than anyone else, describes this as a classic desertification. Finally, the succulent Karoo has just come through the greatest drought in living memory, and some areas are still being impacted. Anecdotal evidence suggests that some populations of succulent species in the Richtersveld have been devastated by the drought, and early published accounts, such as this 2018 article by Gretel van Rooyen and colleagues, suggest that the drought has had a significant negative impact on both wildlife, but also on perennial plant cover, for example, at Guchab Nature Reserve. And perhaps the most convincing canary in the coal mine to date is provided by Nick Helm and Uta Schmiedel's 2020 article in Felt and Flora. Their documentation of widespread mortality of several key species in the lowlands of Namaqualand provides the clearest warning yet, perhaps, of things to come. It seems that the plains environments are particularly badly affected, such as you can see in the top right-hand photograph. What about the fynbos biome? Well, most models suggest that this biome will be severely negatively impacted by climate change. Increased temperatures and reduced rainfall will lead to general aridification of the biome and a loss of species, including some of our more charismatic Proteaceae. Measuring these impacts in the fynbos biome is extremely difficult. This is not only because of fire, which sets everything back to zero on a fairly regular basis, but also because of the dynamic nature of the vegetation. Some species appear to be highly mobile in the landscape, as is shown in this pair of photographs on the right. In 1966, for example, Protea lepidocarpodendron was not visible in this Cape Point landscape, but by 2011, it was so dense that it was almost impossible to walk through the Protea thicket. One of the few studies of long-term change in fynbos was carried out by Zoe Poulsen, who showed how forest cover had increased on the Cape Peninsula, largely as a result of the exclusion of fire. Late 19th century photographs of the peninsula show open landscapes, few trees, or even shrubs, and many bulbs, exactly what you'd expect to find in fynbos, which was burnt on a regular basis. Decades of fire exclusion, however, has resulted in the increase in cover, especially of forest and forest pioneer species, such as in this view of Blinkwater Ravine above Camps Bay. Zoe also visited each one of the 174 forest patches on the Cape Peninsula and used aerial photos to map the change in forest cover between 1944 and 2008. Her mapping showed where the increase had been greatest, and she argued that the changes reflected a recovery from frequent fires, the sort that had been described by Neville Pillins, Rudolf Marloff, and Margaret Levins in a series of articles in the 1924 volume of the South African Journal of Science. Two questions follow from Zoe's work. The first is concerned with the obvious impact of expanding tree cover on fynbos vegetation, and the second asks whether these trends are widespread in the greater Cape forestic region. In terms of the second question, Nina Zitsamia, one of our honor students, looked at long-term changes in forest cover in Swartboschkloof in Jonkershoek near Stellenbosch. She also found an overall increase in forest cover, but the story seemed a bit more complicated in that not all of the riverine forests behaved in the same way. Scree forests were generally stable over time, as one would expect, but some of the riverine forests decreased in cover over time. It seems that the kind of vegetation which is growing right next to you can have important implications for whether you persist, you expand, or you shrink over time. The particular fire history at a site is also critical. What about long-term changes in mountain fynbos locations where the expansion of forest cover is not an issue? How has the cover and composition of mountain fynbos changed generally over the last 100 years? This is an important question because unlike today, we know that people were living in the mountains in the late 19th century. As you can see from this image of the Fissus farm just above the shale band in the Cederberg, people had permanent homesteads, they cultivated small areas, had many animals, and most importantly, as the quote from Marloff suggests, they burnt the mountains to ashes. What effect did this have on the vegetation, and how's it changed now that most fynbos mountains form part of one or other water catchment or conservation area? The best visual example of these mountain fires is this image created by Petra Holden of a 1949 aerial photograph of the Grootwinterhoek wilderness area. The adjacent map of the fire scars of this period shows both the patchiness and the extent of the fires. We're fortunate that before the Grootwinterhoek was declared a wilderness area and protected as a water catchment area, the CSIR set up a series of permanent transects and photos that were resurveyed by Petra Holden and Sam Jack in 2015. Petra's analysis, which formed part of her PhD, showed that for the transect data, canopy cover in vegetation of a similar post-fire age increased overall by 24% and basal cover by 30%. There was a 3.5 to 4.5 times greater probability of striking vegetation in 2015 than there was in 1978. Similarly, Petra's analysis of the repeat photos showed a significant increase in vegetation cover and a decrease in bare ground and rock cover. It's not just about cover either. You can see in the image on the left with Fred Kruger sitting in the foreground that the recent fire in the 1960s was cool and hardly touched the mature Protea lorifolia individuals in the background. Contrast this with the image on the right, which is the same post-fire age. The hot fire which burned through the site a few years before 2013 killed the mature Protea individuals and resulted in many hundreds of new seedlings. Vegetation cover is also significantly greater in 2013 than it was in 1970. Not all fynbos species, of course, benefit from these changes in biomass and in the fire regime. Joe White's study of 1,313 woodring Tonia cedarburgensis individuals in the Cedarburg, for example, show that this species has declined by 74% since 1931. Mortality appears linked to where the species grows, but also to increased fire frequency, although the model didn't explain much of the variance in the data. Any discussion of long-term change in fynbos vegetation wouldn't be complete without a mention of Hugh Taylor's Cape Point plots and the recent results which have emerged as a result of this resampling of 54 of his 10 by 5 meter permanent plots. Jasper Slingsby and colleagues showed that there was a significant decline in the number of species over time, which was driven by severe post-fire summer weather events. Resprouters, graminoids, and herbaceous species seemed especially affected. This study is one of the most important early warnings of the potential impact that climate change could have on fynbos vegetation. After sampling each of his plots, Hugh also took a photograph of the plot layout. One of our MSc students, Robin Powell, revisited Hugh's sites and retook 85 of his photographs. While the photographs do not provide the same granular level of deep detail as the plot data, they're nonetheless really interesting. Not only do they show some of the really dramatic events that can happen at coastal sites such as Potbank, where there's been a complete dune blowout since Hugh's days, they also can show radical changes in vegetation communities, such as at Wildebeest, where a tall graminoid vegetation, restoid vegetation, was completely replaced by shrubland between 1966 and 2012. But for the most part, shrubland behaved as shrubland should. Restiofluctors retained their general physiognomy, and wetlands were still wetlands. They hadn't dried up or become arid wastelands over time. This last point is important because even though the photographs can't provide the level of detail that's available in permanently marked plots, they do provide a more general landscape level perspective and address questions of ecosystem function. As important as the fine plot detail is, it also needs to be scaled up to the landscape and to ecosystem level processes to really make wider sense as well. So that's what we think is going on in some mountain and plains fynbos locations. What about the long-term dynamics in Strandveld vegetation? Two quick photo pairs give you some idea. The first is from the Cape Flats Nature Reserve adjacent to the University of the Western Cape campus in Bellville. The first photograph was taken by Barry Lowe in 1983, while the second photograph forms part of Kim Daniel's honours project and was taken in 2020. The annuals have been removed, but there's been a significant increase in woody plant cover over the 37 years, and this pattern is generalized for the reserve. The second pair is of the coastal plain around Seal Point Lighthouse, just a few hundred meters from Richard Cowling's house in Cape St. Francis. The view was reasonably open just 20 years ago, with a few large gasterias showing off their flowers. Since then, the expansion of low-growing thicket species, such as this prostrate form of milkwood, have taken over much of this landscape and now throttle the gasterias as they struggle for light. So it's a war out there, folks. So that's probably enough about fynbos, and let me shift now to the Namakuru biome. The early story here was dominated by John Aycox's views of an eastward expanding karoo, which was marching to Pretoria and engulfing the Free State grasslands along the way. John argued this was because of overgrazing. Climate change projections suggest a similar contraction of grasslands, but this time it's because of climate change and the general aridification of the region. And one of my earliest contributions challenged this view, and together with Richard Cowling, we argued that the opposite was in fact occurring. I've since had the good fortune of working with colleagues like Amoto Masubelele and James Gembize and William Bond on the problem. And Morta's PhD and subsequent publications confirmed this initial view. A general summary of change in the Namakuru is shown in the figure in the bottom right here, and shows the majority of matched photos either show little change in vegetation cover or an increase, especially in the cover of grasses. This story seems to be the gift that just keeps on giving, and recent work by PhD student Gina Arena has both broadened and deepened our understanding of what's going on in the region. Gina analyzed the data from 18 climate stations, and she resurveyed 27 of Piet Roos' original transects in the Eastern Karoo. She also rephotographed more than 100 sites and looked at the historical stocking rates data to document these changes. Her results suggest that this trend of increasing grass cover has, if anything, intensified over time, both in the Namakuru on the left, as well as in the grassland biome. And it's not just poor quality grass species that have increased in cover at sites that were previously dominated by karoo shrubs. Gina's shown, using a standard rangeland ecology approach, that the carrying capacity has increased nearly fivefold in the karoo and has more than doubled in the grasslands. Gina's analysis of rainfall from 18 locations spread out across the Eastern Karoo shows the last 50 years have been relatively wet compared to the very dry period from 1900 to the mid-1970s. When the reports of the Drought Investigation Commission, the Desert Encroachment Committee, and of course John Aycox's own expanding karoo ideas were produced. And also when Dr. Roux collected his data for his PhD thesis on Tetrachniid regii. This trend of increasing rainfall is supported by a comprehensive analysis of the Middelburg rainfall record by Justin du Toit and Timm, as well as a more recent analysis of sites to the west of Middelburg by Christian Harmse and colleagues in the Upper Karoo, which all these studies show an increase in rainfall in the Namakuru over the second half of the 20th century. Another potential explanation for this increase in grass cover in eastern Karoo is the decline in livestock numbers, especially sheep, since their peak in the 1930s. GINA's analysis of the agricultural census data shows a 67% decline in sheep numbers, driven in part by state-sponsored interventions and other factors, perhaps also drought. Goat numbers have also declined by nearly 90% over the last 100 years. This is not to say that all is necessarily well with the Namakuru biome. It's a very large biome covering a third of the country. In the more arid reaches along the Orange River, for example, Kirsty Ngedenwa's PhD research on Pachypodium namakwanum, the Hoffmans, suggests that some populations have declined precipitously over the last 100 years. Theft on a grand scale is almost certainly involved, but so too is climate. Conditions for the recruitment of the species have changed, and the spectacular images showing Hoffmans leaning northwards might be a thing of the past. Finally, what about the savanna grassland and Indian Ocean coastal belt biomes? We've got about more than 300 repeats of these major eastern biomes, most of which were taken by James Patik. While a full analysis of the images is yet to be completed, they provide a very useful visual representation of the changes, at least, that have occurred sometimes over quite short time frames of only a few decades. Here, for example, is a set of photographs from the Wiener Nature Reserve showing the extent of woody plant thickening between 1955 and 2011 in the foreground slope in the distant valley. Or this site at Driehoek Valley in KZN, which shows the expansion of gallery forest out from the main drainage lines below the escarpment, as well as the increase in savanna species on the ridges themselves. Woody species don't seem to have breached the escarpment itself, although this raises all sorts of questions and hypotheses. One of the most consistent patterns in the eastern part of the country is the abandonment of agricultural fields in the communal lands. Almost without exception, these old lands have become inundated with woody plants, such as at the site in the Eastern Cape. Finally, it's not just the immediate eastern areas where woody plants have thickened up. The arid savannas in South Africa and Namibia have also seen a marked increase in trees, such as at the site at Marcusfontein, south of Kimberley. Had the Boer War been fought 100 years later, far fewer young Boer British and Canadian soldiers would have died, as there would have been better cover for them to hide behind. An analysis of the extent of woody cover encroachment using repeat photos has been superseded by the excellent syntheses undertaken by colleagues such as Andrew Skano and Nikki Stevens, who've mapped bush encroachment using satellite imagery and aerial photography. The change is widespread across the region, but especially in Limpopo, and started long before Southern Africans were talking about climate change. In a few localities where megaherbivores are present, rates of decline, but elsewhere, rates of change can be extremely rapid. Repeat photos can be very helpful in visualizing these changes, not only in terms of the extent of change, but also in terms of the species involved. Sometimes you also get to be part of a really fun project where your students have photographs of themselves as young people, and then return to the same site to study bush encroachment and can't believe how much they and the veld has changed in the meantime. Repeat photos have also been used successfully in the savannas and grasslands to document long-term changes in cycads. Here, Desala Akuba Michael, a postdoc, measured the fate of 626 individual cycads in 73 repeat photos and showed how 78% had survived to the mid-1990s, but by 2014, only 16% of the original number remained. Theft of individuals on privately owned land was the greatest reason for the decline. Nikki Stevens helped us create this summary map for what we think our repeat photos are telling us about vegetation change in South Africa. The map formed part of a general synthesis report called Change is in the Air, which was led by Nikki and other colleagues such as William Bond and Guy Midgley, who are active in the field of climate change. There's a nice video of this story as well for those interested. So in the final slide, I'd like to suggest 4 reasons why the past trajectories don't always align well with future projections. The first is that modeling the future is an extremely complicated process, and it's difficult to include the many complex processes that influence vegetation change. Historical observations provide an integration of these influences. A second reason is that we are still in the very early stages of the changes that are yet to come. If the impact of the recent drought in the low-lying areas of Namaqualand and the Richtersveld is anything to go on, we might soon exceed the physiological thresholds of many species. The responses might also not be immediate, and time lags in species responses to climate change might obscure its impact. Also, long-term data are rather patchy, and it's often difficult from only 2 time steps to get a good idea of the real trajectory of change. Finally, it's also worth considering that a historical view might not be all that helpful, as in some cases, future climate might be like nothing we have ever experienced in the past. That's a thought worth keeping in mind as well. So I'm most grateful to the many students and research assistants, past and present, who worked on the collection of historical photographs, which are currently housed in the Plant Conservation Unit. Thank you very much for all your hard work and dedication. And thank you to all of you for listening to this talk.